Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Bollinger, and I'm a research scientist with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. This presentation will focus on a new paper that I've written with my colleagues Ryan Weiser and Eric O'Shaughnessy, titled Levelized Cost-Based Learning Analysis of Utility-Scale Wind and Solar in the United States. This work was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy and has recently been published in the journal iScience. In a nutshell, this paper uses learning curves and learning curve theory to project the levelized cost of wind and solar energy. Now, this is not a particularly new idea. There are numerous studies out there already that use learning curves for this very same purpose, but we do bring to the table a number of elements that make our study somewhat unique and we think improved, and I'll talk more about those on the next slide. But here in this slide, I just want to introduce the concept of learning curves for those of you who may not be familiar with them. So learning curves, which are sometimes also called experience curves, are a commonly used tool to project future costs based on the historical relationship between cost and production. They're based on the general idea that the more often we do something, the better we become at doing it. So it's this whole notion of learning by doing. And if you translate that notion into a manufacturing context, you can think of it as the more widgets you produce, the more efficient you'll become at producing them, which, all else being equal, should lead to a lower cost of production. So that's the basic idea. Getting a little more detailed, learning curve theory holds that for each doubling of output, costs will fall by some percentage, which is known as the learning rate. And once you've calculated the learning rate based on past experience, you can use it to project future costs as a function of future output. Now, as I mentioned, there have been plenty of learning curve analyses of wind and solar costs. So this is not a new idea or concept, but most of those earlier studies have focused exclusively on the upfront installed cost, or CapEx, of wind and solar plants, measuring the relationship between CapEx and cumulative installed capacity over time. This narrow focus on CapEx is most likely driven by data availability, given that it is relatively easy to find empirical data on the CapEx of wind and solar plants. But upfront CapEx is really just a means to an end. In other words, we incur the upfront cost of installing a wind or solar plant specifically so that we can generate wind or solar energy, which is the real goal here. This, in turn, suggests that instead of focusing on CapEx-related learning, we should instead be focusing on learning related to the levelized cost of wind and solar energy, which is also known as LCOE. The blue box on the right of this slide shows a simple LCOE equation and also defines the handful of inputs that go into calculating LCOE. These include CapEx, of course, but also other elements such as financing costs, taxes, operating expenses, and capacity factor, or annual energy production. In other words, CapEx is just one of a handful of inputs to LCOE, and most of these other inputs can potentially benefit from learning as well. Moreover, the wind and solar industries have historically focused on minimizing LCOE rather than on minimizing CapEx, although those two things do often, but not always, go hand in hand. So just to conclude, what we've done in this paper is to conduct a learning curve analysis that is based on LCOE rather than on CapEx, given that LCOE is clearly the more relevant cost metric. Now, as I've mentioned, the idea of conducting learning curve analysis on wind and solar costs is not new, but our analysis brings together some unique elements to hopefully improve upon the existing literature. And I've listed 5 of them here. First, by drawing on the high quality plant level data that we collect for our annual market tracking reports, we are able to estimate plant level LCOE for the vast majority of utility scale wind and solar plants operating in the United States, which in turn is one of the largest renewable energy markets in the world. So we're working with a big sample. Second, we normalize our plant level LCOE estimates by controlling for a variety of exogenous influences that are unrelated to learning. In other words, we fully recognize that a variety of factors can influence LCOE, and that some of them, such as commodity price and interest rate fluctuations, are beyond the control of the wind and solar industries and have pretty much nothing to do with technology learning. So before we calculate learning rates, we remove the noise caused by those exogenous influences so that we can more clearly detect the signal related to technology learning. Third, as I've already mentioned, we estimate learning rates based on LCOE rather than CapEx, as LCOE has been the industry's preferred optimization target. Fourth, we use a segmented regression model to test whether learning rates have been constant over time, which is often the typical assumption implicit in the literature, or instead whether there have been distinct periods of faster and slower learning. And then finally, we apply this common methodology to both wind and solar rather than to just one or the other, which facilitates cross-technology comparisons. So even though we are traveling a well-worn path by working with learning curves, we've done so in a way that we think improves upon past efforts. This slide provides an overview of our sample and empirical data. Our wind sample extends all the way back to the early days of the US market in the early 1980s and includes 87% of all wind capacity operating in the US as of the end of 2020. Likewise, our solar sample also extends back to the inception of the utility scale PV market in the US, with the first few PV plants larger than 5 megawatts coming online in 2007. And our solar sample also includes about 87% of all utility scale PV capacity operating in the US at the end of 2020. For each of the 1,730 wind and solar plants in our sample, we have empirical data for both CapEx and capacity factor, which are the two most important inputs to LCOE. And then for the other four variables, namely OpEx, useful life, financing costs, and tax rates, we do not have plant level data, but instead vary those inputs by calendar year based on a variety of other sources. And our basic approach is pretty straightforward, and perhaps more importantly, it is the same for both wind and solar. So first, we calculate the actual or raw LCOE for each individual plant using the data that I just described, along with the LCOE formula from slide 2. We then calculate the normalized LCOE for each plant by normalizing each LCOE input to control for exogenous influences that are unrelated to learning. So for example, we normalize each wind and solar plant's CapEx to account for a few things, including differences in construction and labor costs across the US, variations in commodities prices, namely steel for both wind and solar, and then also silicon for solar, movements in exchange rates, given that a lot of this equipment is imported into the US. And finally, for solar, we also account for trade tariffs. We normalize capacity factor to control for regional variation in the quality of the wind or solar resource that's being developed in different years. We normalize finance costs to control for the broader economy-wide reduction in interest rates over the period of analysis. And then finally, we normalize changes to income tax rates over time by setting all years equal to 2020's tax rates. And once we have both raw and normalized LCOE estimates for each plant, we then roll up those plant level estimates to a generation weighted average annual time series based on each plant's commercial operation date. We then regress the normalized LCOE time series against cumulative capacity in order to calculate historical learning rates over the full period of each market. And as I mentioned earlier, we also use segmented regression to identify statistically significant change points in learning over time. And then the final step here is to apply those historical learning rates to future deployment projections in order to estimate LCOE in the future. And here finally, we see the first set of results, namely the actual or raw LCOE. Each turquoise circle represents the LCOE of a wind or solar plant, while the dark blue columns represent the generation weighted average LCOE in each COD year or commercial operation date year. The early year volatility that you see in each market is due to small sample size as the markets began to ramp up. But once you get to roughly the turn of the century for wind and 2010 for solar, things start to settle down a bit. This next slide shows both the raw and normalized LCOE time series. The raw is shown by the dashed line and matches the columns from the prior slide. The solid turquoise line shows the normalized LCOE time series, which you can see is less volatile than the raw time series, and also starts out a bit lower, particularly for wind. And that is due primarily to our normalization of the cost of finance. In other words, interest rates were very high back in the early 1980s, but then declined over time economy-wide. And we are not crediting the wind industry with that particular reduction in financing costs, since it was, as I mentioned, an economy-wide reduction and not wind-specific. Finally, you'll notice here that the average LCOE of wind and solar in the US finally converged in 2020. In other words, the historical LCOE of wind and solar were basically at parity at the end of our study period in 2020. And we'll see in just a few slides what is projected to happen to their respective LCOEs going forward. Here we see the historical learning rates for wind and solar, both over the full period of each market and also broken up by various change points. For wind, the dashed red line shows a full period learning rate of 15%, which again means that for each doubling of cumulative wind capacity over this period, wind's LCOE has declined by 15% on average. But that full period learning rate belies two significant change points that have occurred in roughly 2006 and 2010. The first change point kicked off a period of increasing LCOE, or negative learning, if you want to think about it like that, while the second change point reversed that trend and launched a period of accelerated learning with a learning rate of 40% through 2020. Though in some sense, this recent period of accelerated learning for wind may have been a bit of a correction to the increase in LCOE that we saw from 2006 through 2010. Meanwhile, solar's full period learning rate is 24%, so it's a bit higher than wind's 15%. And solar has only experienced one significant change point around 2014, which kicked off a period of accelerated learning through 2020, where the learning rate was 45%. Since we have time series data for all of the LCOE inputs, we can calculate learning rates for each individual LCOE component as well. All four of the LCOE components shown here have exhibited positive learning, but importantly, none of the wind components exhibit a learning rate that approaches the 15% LCOE-based learning rate for wind. And likewise, none of the solar components exhibit a learning rate that approaches the 24% full period LCOE-based learning rate for solar. And this nicely demonstrates how LCOE reductions are not solely driven by any individual component or input, such as CapEx, but instead depend on learning across multiple inputs, whether it's CapEx, capacity factor, OpEx, or useful life. Again, because we have granular plant level data on the individual LCOE components, we can assess the relative contribution of each to the overall LCOE reductions that we've seen for both wind and solar over time. Those overall reductions are shown by the leftmost columns in each of these graphs. For wind, you can see that CapEx and capacity factor have been the most important contributors to this overall LCOE reduction, while for solar, a falling CapEx has really been the most important driver. All right, ultimately, we want to apply our historical LCOE-based learning rates to future deployment projections in order to see what that implies about LCOE going forward. And this slide shows the global deployment projections that we're using for this purpose. Basically, we sampled a bunch of different projections from a number of sources, including the EIA, the IEA, DNV, BNEF, IRENA, and Wood Mackenzie. And then we ended up focusing on the average of all of those projections. And those averages are shown here in the graphs by the solid black lines. These averages, or average projections, equate to roughly 4,500 gigawatts of cumulative wind capacity by 2050 and 7,000 gigawatts of cumulative solar capacity by that same year. And both of those numbers are global rather than domestic. And then finally, here's what that looks like in terms of LCOE projections beyond 2020. As you'll recall, solar's full period learning rate of 24% exceeded wind's learning rate of 15%. And the solar deployment projections also outpace winds. So it is not surprising to see solar's projected LCOE declining more rapidly than winds as well. The uncertainty surrounding these LCOE projections, however, is much wider for solar than it is for wind. And this is largely due to the much briefer history of utility scale solar in the US. Really just 14 years of experience for solar compared to 39 years for wind. And I'll leave you with one final example to illustrate the significant difference between CapEx-based learning, which again has been the focus of much of the existing literature on wind and solar learning curves, and the difference between that and the LCOE-based learning curve approach that we've taken here. So this graph shows LCOE projections derived two different ways. The orange lines project LCOE by applying our CapEx learning rates to future CapEx while holding all other LCOE inputs constant at 2020 levels. This is essentially how much of the existing literature does it. The dashed purple line, meanwhile, matches the projections that I just showed you on the prior slide based on our LCOE learning rates, which again reflect learning among each of the LCOE components. And you can see that the difference is rather stark with CapEx only learning, potentially underestimating future LCOE reductions by a significant amount. This is an important distinction given that many policies are often formulated with future cost impacts in mind. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. I'd also like to thank the US Department of Energy for funding this work. Please look to the open access journal article on the iScience website. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me or one of my co-authors at the email addresses shown here. Thank you and have a great day.